They vanished without a sound. Days turned into years. Families gave up hope until the truth clawed its way back from the dark. These are 3 real cases where people disappeared and were found years later in ways no one could believe. Case 1. Judith Casita, the woman who disappeared in her own backyard. In the summer of 1976, the Oklahoma heat hung thick over the fields outside the small town of Claremore. The roads shimmered in the sun, cicadas screamed from the trees, and a sense of stillness clung to the air. It was a place where everyone knew each other's names, where the days moved slowly, and where a woman like Judith Casita wasn't supposed to vanish without a trace. But she did. Judith Casita was 38 years old. A mother of 3, she lived in a modest, single-story home on the outskirts of town. Her husband had passed away 2 years earlier in a car accident, leaving her to raise their children alone. By all accounts, Judith was practical, reliable, and deeply rooted in her routine. She worked part-time as a cashier at a local grocery store, tended to her garden every morning, and rarely left home without telling someone where she was going. On the morning of July 4th, Judith woke early. She was planning a quiet afternoon barbecue with her children and her sister, who lived 2 towns over. The day was important, an attempt to inject a little joy back into a life that had grown quieter since her husband's death. At around 7:00 a.m., Judith stepped outside to check on her tomato plants. She was wearing her usual gardening gloves, an old sun hat, and a blue house dress. Her children were still asleep. The neighborhood was quiet. A neighbor, Martha Dalton, later told police that she saw Judith bending over in her backyard around 7:15 a.m., humming to herself and pulling weeds. That would be the last time anyone saw Judith Casita. By 9:00 a.m., her children were awake and confused. Their mother never left them without breakfast, never disappeared without saying a word. By 10:00 a.m., they were knocking on neighbors' doors. By noon, her sister had arrived to find the house open, the stove cold, and Judith's gardening gloves lying in the dirt near a half-pulled weed. The family called the police. The search began quickly. Officers combed through the property. Volunteers from town walked the fields and tree lines nearby. Helicopters flew overhead, scanning the woods behind the house. Dogs were brought in. Nothing. There was no sign of a struggle. No drag marks. No broken fence. No footprints leading away. It was as if Judith had simply evaporated into the morning air. The backyard garden became the epicenter of the investigation. Police found a pair of clippers lying on the grass, the blade rusted, but not broken. A small stool was tipped over. A glass of water, half empty, sat on a nearby stone. It was all so ordinary. Nothing pointed to violence, yet the silence screamed that something had gone terribly wrong. Over the next few days, dozens of theories bloomed. Had she wandered off, overcome by grief or illness? Had she suffered a breakdown and fled? Some neighbors whispered darker possibilities. Perhaps someone had been watching her. Perhaps they had waited for the moment she was alone. 2 days into the search, a neighbor reported something odd. The night before Judith vanished, they had seen a blue pickup truck parked down the road, its headlights off. The driver never got out. When questioned, no one could identify the vehicle. It was never seen again. Weeks passed, then months. The case grew cold. Judith's children moved in with relatives. Her house sat empty, slowly overtaken by weeds and dust. Her name faded from headlines, from conversations, from memory, until 5 years later. In 1981, a construction crew was clearing land just 4 miles from Judith's home. They were building a new access road for a nearby housing development. The land had once been part of an old farm, long abandoned, its fields overgrown and forgotten. As the bulldozer cut into a mound near a thicket of trees, the machine stopped short. The operator had struck something hard. At first they thought it was an old well, but it wasn't. Beneath the packed earth, wrapped in a thin sheet of plastic and cloth, was a human skeleton. The bones were brittle, the skull partially collapsed. Dental records would later confirm it was Judith Casita. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no bullet holes, no broken bones, but forensic experts concluded she had been dead for years. The cause of death remained undetermined. Some suspected suffocation, others believed poison or a blow to the head that left no fractures. The remains were too degraded to say for sure. The land where she was found was owned by a man named Harold Timmons, a reclusive farmer known for keeping to himself. He had died in 1978, 2 years after Judith disappeared. Police tried to tie him to the case, but found no clear link. There were no records of Judith ever interacting with him. No fingerprints, no evidence. Rumors erupted again. Some claimed Harold had been obsessed with her, that he used to drive by her house late at night. Others believed Judith had discovered something she shouldn't have, something worth silencing. But nothing could be proven. No arrests were made. The case technically remained unsolved. Judith's children, now grown, buried their mother in a small cemetery on the edge of Claremore. The headstone was simple: Judith Ann Casita, 1938-1976. Beloved mother, never forgotten. The story of Judith Casita still lingers in the town's memory. An ordinary woman tending to her tomatoes on a summer morning, gone without a sound, found only when the earth itself gave her back. To this day, people in Claremore look over their shoulders a little more carefully. And when the cicadas scream from the trees, they wonder if someone else is watching from just beyond the line of sight. Case 2. Dennis Martin. It was Father's Day weekend in 1969 when the Martin family packed up their gear and headed for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Bill Martin, his 2 sons, Douglas and Dennis, and Bill's father, Clyde, were following a family tradition. They drove from Knoxville, Tennessee, arriving at the Cades Cove area where they planned to hike and camp over the long weekend. Dennis Martin was 6 years old. He was small for his age, but lively, with bright eyes and a mischievous smile. He wore a red shirt, green shorts, and new hiking shoes his father had bought him for the trip. It was a simple, wholesome outing, 3 generations of Martin men walking under the tall trees, following trails cut through one of America's most visited national parks. On June 14th, they hiked up to Spence Field, a grassy meadow nestled high in the mountains. The spot was popular among hikers for its wide views and level terrain, ideal for camping. That afternoon, the Martins encountered another family with children about the same age as Dennis and Douglas. The kids hit it off immediately, running through the field, playing games between the trees, while the adults talked and enjoyed the peace of the mountains. It was during one of these games, something like hide and seek, that Dennis decided to sneak behind a bush to surprise the grown-ups. His father saw him walk toward the edge of the field and vanish into the undergrowth. A few minutes passed, then more. When the other children returned, Dennis did not. Bill Martin called out his son's name. He expected Dennis to jump out laughing, but there was no response. He checked behind the bush where Dennis had disappeared. Nothing. He ran down the trail in both directions, shouting. Still nothing. Panic set in fast. Within an hour, the family had alerted the park rangers. Night was falling and a summer storm loomed. The first search parties combed the immediate area under growing darkness and rain. By morning, hundreds of people had arrived to help rangers, volunteers, even members of the National Guard. Helicopters, bloodhounds, and heat-seeking equipment were brought in. They scoured miles of terrain, ravines, ridgelines, streams, but not a single clue turned up. No torn clothing, no footprints, no sound. Dennis had vanished completely. The official search continued for days. Over the next week, more than 400 people participated. It became one of the largest search operations in the history of the National Park Service. But the more they searched, the more puzzling it became. The area where Dennis had disappeared was thick with brush, but not so dense that a child should have disappeared so utterly. Rangers began to question whether Dennis had really stayed in the area or had somehow been taken away. Then came a strange and chilling account. About 5 miles away, a man named Harold Key and his family had been hiking on the Appalachian Trail near a place called Rowan's Creek. They were unaware of Dennis's disappearance at the time. While walking, Harold's young son suddenly pointed into the woods. There in the trees was what the boy described as a rough-looking man carrying something over his shoulder. The man quickly ducked behind some brush and disappeared. When the Keys later heard about the missing boy, Harold reported what he had seen. He said the figure was dirty, disheveled, and moving fast, almost as if trying to avoid being seen. The thing over his shoulder, he said, could have been a large sack or a child. The authorities considered the sighting, but ultimately dismissed it. The distance was too great, they said, and the timeline didn't fit the known facts. But some rangers weren't so sure. If someone had taken Dennis quickly, deliberately, that would explain the lack of evidence near Spence Field. Over the following weeks, the official search was scaled back. The terrain, already difficult, had been trampled by searchers, possibly destroying any trace evidence. Rainstorms had washed away tracks. Hope faded. The Martins stayed for weeks, hoping for something, anything, but nothing came. They eventually returned home without Dennis. Years passed. Rumors surfaced now and then. Some said wild animals had taken the boy. Others believed he had fallen into a crevice or been swept away by a stream. But these explanations all ran up against the same wall: no remains, no clothing, no bones, not even a scrap. Then, 3 decades later, in the early 2000s, a retired Park Service employee gave an interview to a regional magazine. He recounted the case of Dennis Martin and mentioned something that had long haunted him. He claimed the Harold Key sighting was never taken seriously enough. He also said there were whispers among some rangers back then, stories about feral people living deep in the Smokies. People who stayed off-trail, avoided towns, and didn't want to be found. It was speculation. There was no proof. But for a case with no closure, such theories took hold. Podcasts picked up the story. YouTube channels dissected the timeline. Some pointed to similar disappearances in the region, cases where young boys went missing and were never seen again. The Dennis Martin case became a kind of template for the unknown. Then, in 2019, a new voice entered the conversation. A man who claimed to have been camping with his father in the Smokies in 1969 came forward online. He said he remembered hearing loud footsteps that night, followed by what sounded like a child crying, and then silence. His father told him never to speak of it again. The man couldn't say for sure it was Dennis, but the memory had stuck with him for 50 years. The post went viral. People debated its authenticity. But what stood out wasn't the details, it was the pattern. Again and again, people recounted things they'd seen or heard near the area during that weekend: screams, flashes of red in the trees, strange figures in the distance. None of it added up. Yet none of it could be ruled out either. To this day, Dennis Martin's fate remains a mystery. There is no gravestone, no known resting place. Just a date. June 14, 1969, and a red shirt vanishing into green brush. What happened in those woods that afternoon may never be known. But for those who have studied the case, who walked the trails and turned over stones, one fact is harder to shake than all the theories in the middle of a crowded park under the gaze of family and strangers alike. A child disappeared, and not a single trace was left behind. By the second day of the search, the park had been divided into grid zones, and rangers moved in strategic sweeps covering every creek hollow and thicket near Spence Field. Bloodhounds were brought in, but the rain had likely erased any useful scent trails. The dogs circled aimlessly, occasionally alerting, but never with certainty. Helicopters flew low over the ridges, their rotors chopping the mist, but from the air, the forest was a blur of green, endless and indifferent. The third and fourth days saw an influx of military personnel from Fort Bragg. They wore fatigues and carried radios, but even they were overwhelmed by the rugged terrain. Steep inclines, sudden drops, and dense laurels made progress slow. Some rescuers began to voice concerns that the sheer volume of people might be hurting more than helping. Every footstep trampled potential evidence footprints, broken branches, disturbed brush. It was a search effort that grew too big too fast, and the area was quickly becoming contaminated. Still, the Martins refused to give up. Bill Martin remained on the ridge each day, calling his son's name until his voice cracked. Clyde, the grandfather, spent hours with a flashlight sweeping through the trees after dark, convinced Dennis had simply gotten lost and was waiting for rescue. But every passing hour made that hope harder to hold. By the end of the first week, the emotional toll was visible. Reporters swarmed the park entrance. Headlines read, "Boy lost in Smokies and hope fades in wilderness search." People across the country sent letters to the Martins, some offering prayers, others cruelly suggesting theories or blaming the parents. Psychics wrote in claiming visions of caves or shallow graves. Rangers entertained none of it. They stuck to the facts or tried to. But internally, confusion and disagreement plagued the investigation. Some believed Dennis had simply wandered too far and perished from exposure. Others insisted he had been taken either by a predator human or otherwise. A third theory, whispered but rarely printed, suggested that someone may have seen something and stayed silent. The Harold Key sighting refused to die. Though officially downplayed, it gnawed at several rangers. Key had no reason to lie. His son had clearly seen someone, and the direction matched a rough line from Spence Field to Rowan's Creek. Could someone really have carried a child that far in such a short time? It was improbable, but not impossible. In the years that followed, the Martin family maintained quiet dignity. They rarely gave interviews. Bill Martin continued hiking the Smokies for years afterward, revisiting the last place he saw his son. He never found anything. No marker, no sign. Just wind in the trees and the sound of boots on dirt. Meanwhile, the legend of Dennis Martin grew. Hikers who passed through Spence Field sometimes left small toys or red cloth near the tree line, quiet memorials to a boy they never knew. True crime writers and amateur sleuths published theories ranging from the plausible to the paranormal. One popular idea suggested underground caves might have swallowed Dennis' natural sinkholes common to the Appalachian terrain. Another theory claimed he had been killed and buried by a drifter who then fled the park. Some locals believed the Key family's account more than the officials did. Stories of wild men in the hills had existed long before 1969 hermit communities that avoided contact and moved with stealth. Though no evidence has ever surfaced, the idea that something human yet separate was watching from the trees gained a foothold. The National Park Service eventually closed the file as an unsolved disappearance. But for many, that wasn't enough. The absence of any physical evidence made the case feel unfinished, as if Dennis was still out there, just beyond the reach of memory or map. Even decades later, hikers report odd feelings near Spence Field's sudden silence, strange dreams after camping there, children feeling watched. In 2021, a hiker posted a video online claiming they'd found a small red scrap of cloth snagged on a branch near an off-trail ridge close to the Martin site. The clip gained traction, but after investigation, it was revealed to be synthetic, likely a modern hiking marker. The hope it ignited was real, though brief. People still want answers. And so the story continues looping through generations, always returning to that same image, a child in a red shirt, disappearing into the green. Case 3. Alyssa Turney. It was the last day of school before summer break, May 17, 2001, when 17-year-old Alyssa Turney vanished. That morning, she had attended classes at Paradise Valley High School in Phoenix, Arizona. Friends described her as upbeat, a little rebellious, but grounded. She was planning to go to a graduation party that night and had even arranged to meet friends at a fast food spot later that afternoon. At home, she lived with her stepfather, Michael Turney, and her younger half-sister, Sarah. Their mother had passed away years earlier, and Michael had taken over legal guardianship. The family dynamic was odd, but not outwardly alarming. Alyssa and Michael often clashed, typical, some said, of a teenager and a strict parent. Still, Alyssa had never run away before, and nothing in the days leading up to her disappearance suggested she would. That morning, Michael picked her up early from school. He told Sarah and later the police that he and Alyssa had gotten into an argument about her summer plans. He claimed he dropped her off at home around 11 a.m., and that when he returned later, she was gone. According to him, she had left a note saying she was running away to California. The note was short, handwritten, and oddly impersonal for a teenager, leaving her entire life behind. She had left behind her cell phone, her clothes, her money, and most notably, her plans. She had never made it to the graduation party. None of her friends had heard from her. No one received a call, a text, nothing. Just silence. In the beginning, the Phoenix police treated it as a runaway case. Teenagers ran off all the time, they said. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, that theory began to fall apart. There was no activity on Alyssa's bank account, no use of her social security number. She didn't contact her friends or family. She had simply evaporated. Michael Turney, however, remained confident in the runaway theory. He said Alyssa had been unhappy, rebellious, and had spoken of going to California. He insisted that she left on her own. He also began telling people that the local electrical union where he had worked was somehow involved in a plot against the family. The more he talked, the stranger things sounded. Michael kept a large collection of surveillance footage in the house. He claimed to have recorded every phone call. He wired the home with cameras. Some believed it was for safety. Others said it pointed to a deep paranoia or something more sinister. Over the years, Michael grew more erratic. He self-published a 300-page manifesto outlining what he called the truth behind Alyssa's disappearance. In it, he claimed the government had kidnapped her. He pointed fingers at co-workers, the police, and even his own family. He mailed copies of the manifesto to reporters, private investigators, and police departments across Arizona. Through all of it, one person never stopped looking: Sarah Turney. She was only 12 years old when Alyssa disappeared. But as she grew older, she began asking questions Michael refused to answer. By the time Sarah was in her 20s, she had started digging through the case file herself, submitting FOIA requests, tracking timelines, and comparing stories. In 2017, Sarah went public. She launched a podcast and began posting regularly about Alyssa's case. She shared documents, inconsistencies, and clips of Michael making contradictory statements. Her social media presence grew rapidly. People across the country began paying attention. Then, in 2020, Sarah posted a TikTok that went viral. In it, she accused her father directly, saying, "My sister didn't run away. Our dad killed her." The video exploded online. True crime communities, influencers, and even national media picked up the case again. Pressure mounted. That same year, nearly 2 decades after Alyssa disappeared, Michael Turney was arrested, charged not for Alyssa's disappearance directly, but for possession of multiple illegal weapons, including pipe bombs, found during a prior search of his home. In that search, police had uncovered a stockpile, 19 high-caliber rifles, silencers, explosive materials, and detailed notes suggesting he had planned an attack on a local union hall. While the weapons charges were serious, investigators began quietly reopening the missing person case. New witnesses were re-interviewed, old leads revisited. The surveillance tapes Michael once claimed to have were mysteriously missing. No one had ever seen the original footage from the day Alyssa vanished. Then, in August 2020, Michael Turney was officially charged with second-degree murder in the death of Alyssa Turney. Prosecutors alleged that the story of her running away had never made sense, and that new evidence pointed to Michael being the last person to see her alive, with no credible proof that she left the house under her own power. The indictment came as both a shock and a vindication. For Sarah, it was the moment she had fought for through years of resistance, denial, and grief. But the case was far from closed. Alyssa's body had never been found. There was no physical evidence tying Michael to the crime scene, no fingerprints, no DNA, no confession. It would be a difficult case to prove in court. In 2023, the charges were dropped. Prosecutors cited insufficient evidence to proceed. The disappointment was sharp. Sarah Turney posted publicly saying the system had failed again, but vowed not to stop. To this day, Alyssa's fate remains legally unresolved. She is still listed as a missing person. But in the eyes of many, especially those who have followed the case through Sarah's lens, the truth is clearer than ever. A teenage girl vanished from her own home, leaving behind no trace, no plan, and no way to leave. Only the silence remained, and the voice of a sister who refused to let that silence win. In the immediate days after Alyssa's disappearance, Michael Turney maintained a surprisingly calm demeanor. He told police she had likely gone to California and that they didn't need to worry. But friends and classmates began voicing concerns. One of Alyssa's best friends said she had never once mentioned running away, not even jokingly. Teachers said she had turned in all her textbooks, signed yearbooks, and talked excitedly about summer. She had plans. She was grounded in her routine. Her vanishing didn't match the profile of a runaway. Still, the police didn't open a full criminal investigation. Michael's status as her legal guardian and his insistence on the runaway narrative kept things quiet. Sarah, only 12 at the time, was confused, but trusting. Her father told her Alyssa had abandoned them and that the world was dangerous. She believed him. For a while, years passed. Michael pulled Sarah out of public school. They homeschooled. The house became more isolated. Cameras appeared in corners. Phone calls were recorded. Michael told Sarah they were being watched by government agents. At the time, she thought it was protection. Later, she realized it might have been control. Meanwhile, the few detectives who looked into the case found themselves up against a wall. Michael had retained a lawyer and refused to let them question him further. Without a crime scene or physical evidence, the case stalled. The note supposedly left by Alyssa was never fingerprinted. The house was never treated as a potential crime scene. When Sarah reached adulthood, she began to question the narrative. She remembered moments that didn't feel right, like the way Michael always shut down any mention of Alyssa, or the time he destroyed a box of her belongings, claiming it was to help move on. She remembered the fear she felt without knowing why. Her investigations were tireless. She filed dozens of records requests, transcribed old reports, contacted reporters, and even hired a private investigator. She pieced together timelines, matched inconsistencies, and pushed the story into the public eye. And when social media began amplifying her voice, the tide started to shift. Public outrage grew after the 2020 viral video. People were shocked not only by Alyssa's story, but by the fact that it had gone so long without resolution. Journalists revisited old documents. Podcasts picked up the case. Sarah was invited to speak on panels, interviews, and documentaries. The once-forgotten case became national news. Following Michael's arrest, the FBI released more details. The weapons cache wasn't just random. It included a written plan to bomb the local International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Union Hall. Authorities believed Michael had intended to commit domestic terrorism, though the attack was never carried out. That discovery raised deeper questions if he was capable of that. What else might he have done? By 2022, Michael Turney was a frail man in his 70s. He continued to deny involvement in Alyssa's disappearance. He maintained that she had run away and that any accusations against him were lies. But few believed him anymore. Sarah, meanwhile, continued her campaign for justice, not just for Alyssa, but for all cold cases mishandled by the system. She testified before state lawmakers, advocated for better missing persons protocols, and helped other families tell their stories. Through pain, She had created purpose. Though Alyssa's remains have never been found, her name now echoes across platforms, classrooms, and courtrooms, not as another missing girl, but as a symbol of what happens when people don't give up. Her story remains open not because it lacks an ending, but because the ending has yet to be proven. For Sarah and for many who followed the case, the truth has already spoken. It speaks through the silence, through the contradictions, through the facts no one can explain away. And until the day her sister is brought home, Sarah Turney will keep telling the story that should have never needed telling. Some stories don't end. They just fall silent and leave behind questions no one can answer. Subscribe for more true crime that stays with you long after the screen goes dark.